Hi, I'm Bob Hancock from the Google Ads API Developer Relations team. Today I'll be talking with Mattia Tommasone from our team about the developer experience with PMax. Now, PMax requires you to think differently about how you create and modify campaigns. So, Mattia, what are some of the things that developers should think about differently?
So, hi Bob and hi everyone. So there's two aspects to PMax. One is that actually working with PMax with the Google Ads API is really similar to what developers are, in my opinion, already familiar with. So the structure of the API is exactly the same. So you have resources, you have services to manage resources, and the request response mechanism is the same. However, the mindset that you should be in when working with PMax is slightly different from the one that you may be used to when working with the Google Ads API. This is because when working with search campaigns, for instance, you may be used to thinking in terms of campaigns and then ad groups and then ads. Whereas when working with PMax, the mindset you should be working with is working with campaigns and then asset groups and then assets. And this makes it slightly different. And the reason for this is that the grouping of assets to actually create an ad that is going to be delivered as an impression to users is actually made by Google AI to ensure that the ads built from your assets are going to be performing as best as they can, depending on the channel they're being delivered on. So, for instance, an ad built for being delivered on YouTube, it's going to be entirely different from an ad built for being delivered on search. And this is what Google AI takes care of, and you don't really need to think about because we do this for you. And all you have to think about when working with PMax is just what types of assets and what assets describe your business and your company. And then we will assemble the best performing ads for you. So in terms of thinking, how should I be advertising my company, my business for customers to see? The mindset of PMax is, how do I describe my company and let then Google AI build the right advertisement for that? So this is the biggest change of mindset. But apart from that, the way the API works is exactly the same. So you build assets using the asset resource and the asset service, just as you would build an ad group for a search campaign. So one of the fun things about working with PMax is that the way the code looks and feels is really similar, but the mindset you have to be in when writing it is slightly different because the entities are actually different, even if the code that you write to work with them is very similar.
That's great. Now, you brought up a point about assets, which is something we've had for a while, but they're such an integral part of PMax. One of our best practices that we suggest is that you should upload as many assets as possible, because as you said, your assets are going to help describe what your business is and what your goal is. So we suggest that you upload as many assets as possible, up to the maximum for each type of asset. But what's the most efficient way to do that? And are there any limitations or gotchas that we should be aware of as developers?
Well, this is a very good question because I just did a session on best practices and optimization where I discussed some of these. So there are indeed a few gotchas and a few, things that you should be keeping in mind when working with assets. So first of all, there's a new feature that we recently released in April 2024, which allows managing assets and asset groups for PMax with batch jobs. So this wasn't supported until recently, but now you can. So this means that you can use batch jobs to asynchronously manage your assets and asset groups. So this is a good optimization tip when trying to work with large batches of assets. But thing is, there is indeed a gotcha, which is related to the size of the requests that you are sending to the Ads API. So there is a size limit for API request, which currently is 10 megabytes. So even if the size limit for image assets is 5 megabytes, the size limit for the request is 10 megabytes, meaning that you're likely not going to be able to create several big image assets in a single API request. So this means that ultimately what it resolves to is that you have to strike a good balance between bundling everything in a single request or in a single batch job, or splitting everything in a single API request. So every asset group in a separate API request. There is a balance to this. And of course, as to every good question, the right answer is it depends. So the two extremes are, bundling everything in a single request, which may or may not work according to the size limit that we just discussed, or having each request separate from each other, so doing everything in a single request, and these are the two extremes. And of course, the right way is somewhere between these two extremes, but where exactly it sits may depend on how your assets look like, what types of assets they are. So if you have a lot of text assets rather than image assets, of course, the answer is going to vary. So this is a very good question in that it doesn't have a very definite answer. The answer to this is it depends. And what I can suggest to this is actually to, try to find where the right balance for you is, and then also keep an eye on, monitoring how your requests go, and see if you can actually update this balance over time, because it's also going to vary according to how your campaigns are going, on what you want to do with your campaigns, for instance.
Okay. So I'm taking from this that this is the size limit, I would say, and batch job is primarily a problem if you have extremely large images. If you're using text objects, we limit those in size. I think you're unlikely to hit the 10 megabyte limit for batch job requests. Would that be a valid statement?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think it's fairly impossible for you to hit 10 megabytes of text assets.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, even if you did, we still have limits on the size of these text assets in terms of characters. So I don't think you can hit 10 megabytes of text.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the takeaway we're trying to say with this is there is a limit of size. You're unlikely to hit it unless perhaps you have 5 megabyte images. All of your images are 5 megabytes, and then you can upload them serially with mutates. So there is a solution for it, but it's something obviously that we should be aware of. So now you've uploaded your assets and you have your campaigns running. Now, one of the things we have in PMax is that there's both predictive and generative AI, that we could create a new headline, and we can also make decisions on how, as you said, ads should be composed from assets. So in order to have an insight for that, we have a number of new reports that help PMax users understand how their campaigns and assets are performing. And Laura is talking about that in detail in a separate segment. But I'd like to know from you, is there anything that developers need to do differently with the new reports?
Well, again, it's kind of similar to how it happened when I was talking about managing campaigns. So managing reporting for campaigns is both familiar and requiring a slight change of mindset, because the way reporting works from a purely technical standpoint is exactly the same as it does for every other campaign type and every other resource in the Google Ads API. So the way reporting works is that you send GACL queries, and the GACL queries for PMax campaigns and for PMax oriented work are exactly the same. So you send GACL queries for the PMax resources that you want to get reporting for, and the GACL syntax is exactly the same. So you have familiar concepts like date segmentations, metrics, and stuff like that, which makes it so that the API experience is actually pretty coherent, in that you don't have anything that looks like entirely unexpected when working with PMax. However, there's also the same mindset shift that you have to be working with when working with PMax. So you have to reason in terms of assets and asset groups rather than in terms of ads and ad groups. So this is the main difference. And again, Reporting with PMax is also slightly different because, as you mentioned, we have predictive and generative AI creating assets also, which means that there are some reporting features that give you reporting and metrics, for instance, only at the asset group level or only at different levels of granularity. So this means that the level of granularity that you have with PMax is maybe slightly different than the one you're used to, but still, the whole gist of reporting in general is that we want to offer you as many insights as possible to make sure that you can optimize your campaigns. But also, when working with PMax, there's also a part where you also have to understand that some of these workings that PMax deals with are managed by Google AI, and what you get is the result of how Google AI manages your ads, and you get how the ads generated by Google AI are actually performing. So you will not get maybe how individually each asset is performing, but you get the result of the ads built from those assets.
Okay, so I think there's two things that I'm taking away from it, and it's been a consistent theme, is that the programming structure is either very similar or the same that everyone is used to. So there's not a big paradigm shift. In fact, there's virtually no shift whatsoever. It works the same way. The shift is really in the way that you think about what you're programming for, that as opposed to individual ads and perhaps creatives that you created yourself, you have assets and you think in terms of asset groups as opposed to individual ads. Give Google the components that you would like to use, and then the reporting will let you know how they are performing over a period of time. So to help with that, we have examples for some of the PMax specific operations in our client libraries. And I bring it up because I'm always surprised when I talk to people who are just starting out that they're not aware that we have client libraries in several programming languages. And part of the client libraries is we have an entire directory of examples. Then we encourage, obviously, developers to use our client libraries. Can you talk about some of the advantages of using our client library as opposed to rolling it on yourself?
Sure thing. So first of all, we offer 6 different client libraries. We have one for Java, one for Python, we have one for PHP, and then we also have Ruby, .NET, and Perl. So if you're working in one of these 6 languages, basically what you get from the client libraries is that most of the hard work and the boilerplate is already being handled for you. So for instance, like authentication, which is one of the parts where developers tend to struggle a bit, is already handled by the client libraries. So you just have to put your credentials in a configuration files or in environment variables, and the client libraries deal with authentication for you. And they basically take away the complexity of dealing with OAuth from you, or at least most of it. And then you also get some interesting features from client libraries. Say, for instance, you have logging for request and response bodies, which is very helpful when you are debugging what's happening in your interactions with the API. And that's really helpful also when you want to engage, for instance, with support. Because if you're having issues with the API and the API doesn't behave the way you're expecting, and you want to share this behavior with API support, having logged the request and response bodies is extremely helpful because you're able to describe exactly what's going on and what you're expecting. So logging in general is extremely helpful for debugging, and it's something that, again, client library provide basically for free. You mentioned that each of our client libraries provide a directory of examples, and that is probably, in my experience, working with the developer community, one of the features that developers tend to like the most, because the set of code examples that we provide basically give you, as a developer, a set of features that are basically ready to implement. And this is probably especially helpful when working with PMax. So working with PMax makes it so that you have to work with several different resources in the API. So it's not just campaigns and it's not just assets, but you also have asset groups, and then you also have asset group assets to link assets to asset groups, and then you have asset group signals, and then you may also have asset group listing group filters if you're building a performance mask for retail campaign. So even if PMax generally simplifies a lot of your work, it is also pretty complex to work with because there is a lot of resources involved. So having an example that basically shows you exactly what resources you need to build with the API, in which order you need to build them, because the order matters too, and how exactly to build them so they pass validation, I think is extremely helpful. And it's probably more helpful than any guide or video content we could ever make, because you get the code, which is ultimately what provides you the source of truth. So I guess that's like the biggest thing that the client libraries provide. And ultimately, also, one of the things I also like about client libraries is that we maintain it. I mean, I'm pretty proud of the work we do with client libraries. I know you're also a maintainer of one of our client libraries, and I think they do a good job.
Yeah, I've got to put in a plug for this. If you are starting out, and Mattia mentioned list filters, which even for us, it's a feature that takes a while to wrap your mind around it. But if you look at our examples for it, we know as programmers that most of the time we'd rather read code than documentation, because we're going to take it in more quickly. So I highly encourage people to look at the examples, to first of all, to use our client libraries, and second, to look at the examples. This can save you a lot of time, not only getting started, but as you go forward, you are given best practices and you can apply them to your own business cases. So let's think what we talked about. Use the client libraries. You're going to need a different mindset, but the way of interacting with the API hasn't changed. It's still going to be the same API, just different resources and services. So it's really the mindset that you have to change. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'll open this to you. Is there any other advice that you would give developers to help them with using PMax?
Well, one of the biggest gotchas that I hit when working with PMax. So again, the first advice that I would give to developers when working with PMax is what you just said. The API is always the same. It is the mindset that you have to change. But if I had to think of like the biggest gotcha that I hit when working with PMax, it is that like from a purely programming, purely from a code standpoint, the biggest difference is that when working with PMax, the order of operation is even more relevant than it is when working with other resources. So of course, when you're working with resources that depend on one another, say for instance, you're creating a campaign budget and a campaign, it is fairly easy to understand that the campaign budget needs to be created before the campaign, because the campaign has a campaign budget. But this is not as intuitive when working with PMax, because there are resources that don't necessarily depend on one another, say, for instance, like asset group assets related to the same asset groups, but still, they need to be ordered correctly. And this is exactly one of the cases where our code examples come in really handy, because they show you exactly what the right order is, and it may not be as intuitive. It may not be as easy to grasp at the first try, but if you look at our code examples, you actually see what the right order to create the resources is, and it really helps you. So it's probably something that I found myself struggling a bit with, but we have a solution for that.
That's great. So we'll come back again. Folks, if you're watching this and you're a developer, look at our client libraries. We highly recommend them.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Mattia. And to all of our developers out there, please be sure to give us feedback. Our team is always looking for input from our developers on how we can improve the developer experience. Don't be shy. Let us know what you really think. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the workshop. Talk to you guys later.